Betsy Wills' mother passed 1 week ago. She gave an eulogy at the funeral service on Wednesday. Today's speech is the eulogy she gave at the service. Please welcome Betsy Wills as she gives memories of my mother.
As the introduction just said, this is the eulogy I gave for my mother in my hometown of Pittsfield, Massachusetts. You are my home club and the people that know me the most. So I wanted to give this same eulogy about my mother to my home club. My mother, her name is Yolanda Campoli Cancilla. You could probably guess that they're a little bit Italian. Campoli Cancilla. She grew up in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, where I grew up. And she is definitely a Taurus. If you don't know astrology, Taurus is the bull. If they like you, they really like you. If they don't like you, you know it. Because the bull can do things that we would prefer not to have done. So today I want to describe to you in 3 different parts memories of my mother. The friends and family that she had in Pittsfield, some of the trips that Mom and Dad went on, and then some of my favorite foods that always remind me of my mother. Before I get started, I have 2 pictures to pass around. This picture, which I'm going to give to Tim, is my mother and father and the Campolis, which are my closest family. My mother is the one with the white dress and the long beads, because there's 2 women in there, and you'll see that. David, over here, this is the house I grew up in, 20 Flintstone Drive. Yes, Flintstone Drive in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. My nickname was Wilma. Can you guess what? And both of these pictures remind me of my mother. She only had her brother, Uncle Andy, that's in there, one of the tall, and Mom. They were their own small family with my grandmother, Noonie. She had cousins, the same as I have cousins, named the Nuceforos. And she spent most of the time with the Nuceforos growing up, spending time with them, being friends with them. And in my family, in my years, it was the Campoli kids. That's all the kids that are in there. I was part of the Campoli family without being a part of the Campoli family because I'm an only child. So it was kind of a mixed family would be best. With the Campolis and the Cancillas, I did have fun in Pittsfield. The other people that were important in Mom's life were our neighbors, those right around 20 Flintstone. We moved up to that house when I was 4 years old. That's 53, 54 years ago, give or take a little. And the neighbors that we had up on Ann Drive Hill, that was the hill, came to Mom's funeral service and wake. I never realized, because I moved away after college, how important all those friends were. Mrs. Samsel, Mrs. Salmons, Mrs. Hurd. They were the keepers of my mother's memory. And the other people that were most important is Mom's bridge club. Mom played bridge every Tuesday afternoon for I don't know how many years. Even after she started getting sick, she would still go to the bridge club and play with those ladies. They came when Mom was starting to get sick to the hospital just to see how Mom was doing, because she went downhill very quickly. My father died about 4 years ago, but still having Mom around didn't hit me quite as much. So my parents, as you can see in the house, that's a really nice looking house, fairly expensive. It was out here in LA. What they would do is go on trips, and the main trip my mother and father did is go antiquing. Now, my house has antique clocks, antique, you name it, dolls, clocks, rugs. When I was 8 or 10 years old, would you want to live in a museum? That's what it felt like, because there was nothing modern in our house. It was just the antiques that Mom and Dad always got. I hated it, but I kind of liked it. Remember, if you're about 8 or 10 years old and you go to any store, don't touch anything. You break it, you buy it. Does that sound like anybody's mother or father? But after a while, I really realized how much I was getting from both my mother and father. They would go on trips to Italy a lot, to other countries. I did not travel with them very much. When I did travel, there were two main vacations that I remember the most important. Again, when I was in elementary school, we went down to Colonial Williamsburg in Williamsburg, Virginia. I went with my cousin Tom, one of the ones that's going through, and during that week, it was when Barbara Walters was still on the Today Show, so we know how many years ago that is. We were there when they were filming from the Today Show at Colonial Williamsburg. Oh, that was absolutely fun. I got my love of history from both my mother and father. My father really should have been a history teacher. But I learned so much from both of them, from their storytelling and the things that they would do. The other trip that I remember, again with my cousins, the Campolis, was in 1960, 61, give or take, 62, I forget what year. It was the year that The Sound of Music came out. And in early 60s, give or take a little. What we did with two of my cousins and myself and my mother and father went to see The Sound of Music. Well, Dad and Mom were spendthrifts. They would not spend money on hardly anything. And when they went to that place, all they would say is, all I want to do is buy a few tickets. I don't want to buy the whole theater, but I will always remember The Sound of Music with my mother because of the trip that I took with her. The other trips were later on, once I grew up and I moved away. I went with Mom and Dad to some of the museums in Toronto after a church convention I was on. And I also went to London, England with my parents and did the play thing. We saw Les Miserables. I mean, I felt like the jet setter. Finally, the last of my memories of my mother are the food that she would cook. Because you're Italian Catholic, and at least in the early 1960s, they had a thing called Friday Night Special. That was eggs and cheese and bread in a souffle. And it was called Friday Night Special because we couldn't eat meat on Friday. Good Catholic girls don't do that until they allowed us to. Then they would make on Saturday Night Special, which is Friday Night Special with ham, because then we could have it with ham. The other favorite foods that I have with my was something called blonde brownies. Most brownies are dark. Well, these were blonde. But I could never say it. I always ended up blonde blondies. Do you want some blonde blondies? And I still make them today. The food that I had at my mother's house reminds me of my mother. And I know Mom and Dad are together in heaven, probably antiquing just today.